Maria Elena Vasquez stood quietly in the corner of the law office, her dark eyes downcast as her husband Robert Patterson dominated the conversation with their divorce attorneys. She had perfected this stance over 12 years of marriage, the art of making herself invisible while absorbing every word that passed between the lawyers. Before we dive deeper into this story of hidden strength and ultimate justice, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this from today? Are you in a place where you've witnessed someone being underestimated because of their accent or background? Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. This story hits different when you realize how universal these experiences really are. Robert leaned back in his leather chair, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, projecting the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own superiority. He spoke to his attorney James Morrison as if Maria wasn't even present, gesturing dismissively when her name came up in the conversation. She was always like this, Robert explained to Morrison, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed exasperation that Maria had grown to recognize over the years. Quiet, never really understood the complexities of business or legal matters. He chuckled softly, shaking his head with what he believed was fond tolerance. Poor thing tries her best, but English isn't really her strong suit. She gets confused easily when we talk about anything more complicated than grocery lists. Maria's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the handle of her simple black purse. She had learned long ago to control every visible reaction, to present the image that Robert and his family expected to see. The submissive immigrant wife who had been lucky enough to marry into American prosperity. Morrison nodded sympathetically, making notes on his legal pad. He had represented men like Robert before, successful businessmen whose foreign-born wives had become inconvenient obstacles to their next chapter in life. These cases were usually straightforward, especially when language barriers were involved. The wife would get a modest settlement, maybe limited visitation with the children if they were lucky, and the husband would move forward with someone more suitable to his social standing. In the weeks leading up to this meeting, Robert had been meticulously building his case not just with Morrison, but with anyone who would listen. At their country club, over golf games and expensive dinners, he had painted a picture of a marriage burdened by fundamental incompatibilities. She tries, he would say with a heavy sigh, but Maria just doesn't have the education or sophistication to really understand my world. It's been difficult, especially when it comes to making decisions about the children's future. The children in question were Sophia, 14, and Diego, 12. Both were honor students who spoke perfect English and Spanish, a fact that Robert often forgot to mention when discussing Maria's supposed limitations. When pressed about their academic excellence, he would credit their expensive private schools and his own involvement in their education, conveniently overlooking the hours Maria spent helping them with homework at the kitchen table each night. Robert's mother, Patricia Patterson, had been even more vocal in her support of the divorce proceedings. At her weekly bridge club meetings, she would shake her perfectly coiffed head sadly when discussing her daughter-in-law. The poor dear just never quite fit in, she would confide to her friends over afternoon tea. She sits through our family discussions looking completely lost, never contributing anything meaningful. And her English, well, it's improved over the years, but she still struggles with anything beyond basic conversation. These conversations had a way of spreading through their social circle like wildfire. Maria had become a cautionary tale among the wives, a reminder of what happened when successful men made romantic choices based on beauty rather than compatibility. At dinner parties, she would notice the pitying glances from other women, the way conversations would slow down and become overly simplified when she approached a group. What none of them realized was that Maria understood every word, every subtle insult, every patronizing tone. She had learned early in her marriage that knowledge was power, and power was something she needed to accumulate carefully and quietly. So she listened, absorbed, and filed away every piece of information for a day she knew would eventually come. Robert's business partner, Marcus Chun, had also been enlisted in the character assassination campaign. During depositions, he would testify about board meetings where Maria would attend company social events, describing her as pleasant but obviously out of her depth when business matters came up. She would smile and nod politely. He would explain, but you could tell she had no idea what we were discussing when we talked about quarterly projections or market analysis. The irony of Chin's testimony would become apparent later, but for now it served Robert's purposes perfectly. He needed to establish a pattern of Maria's intellectual limitations, a foundation that would support his claims for full custody of Sofia and Diego. After all, how could someone who struggled with basic business concepts be trusted to make important decisions about their children's education and future? Maria's own attorney, Elena Rodriguez, seemed overwhelmed by the opposition's preparation and resources. Rodriguez was competent but overworked, handling dozens of cases simultaneously for clients who couldn't afford the premium legal representation that men like Robert took for granted. During their brief meetings, Rodriguez had advised Maria to be realistic about her expectations, to focus on securing adequate child support and visitation rights rather than fighting battles she was unlikely to win. The legal strategy was becoming clear to everyone in that downtown office building. Robert Patterson, successful entrepreneur and pillar of the community, would receive primary custody of his children and retain control of the business empire he had built through years of hard work and strategic thinking. His wife, Maria, would receive a modest financial settlement and perhaps supervised visitation with the children until they were old enough to make their own choices about relationships with their mother. Even the court staff had begun to form opinions about the case before it officially began. The Patterson name carried weight in their city, and Robert's donations to local charities and political campaigns had earned him a reputation as a civic-minded businessman. His wife, by contrast, was virtually unknown outside of her role as his spouse. She didn't serve on any boards, didn't attend fundraising galas without him, and had never given interviews to the local newspaper about philanthropic activities. What they didn't know was that Maria Elena Vasquez had been preparing for this moment since the day she realized that her marriage was built on a foundation of systematic deception and control. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every instance of Robert taking credit for ideas that had originated from their quiet conversations at home had been carefully documented and stored away. The woman sitting silently in that law office, appearing to struggle with legal concepts and complex terminology, was about to become something entirely different. But for now, she maintained her performance, allowing Robert to continue building the very rope he would eventually use to hang himself in court. The strategy session in James Morrison's corner office took place on a gray Tuesday morning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's financial district. Robert Patterson sat across from his attorney, a stack of carefully organized documents spread between them like battle plans. Morrison had built his reputation on cases exactly like this one, where successful men needed to extricate themselves from marriages that had become inconvenient to their continued prosperity. Morrison leaned forward, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the morning light as he outlined their approach. The key, he explained to Robert, was establishing a clear pattern of Maria's inability to comprehend complex matters, particularly those involving their children's welfare and future. They needed to demonstrate that awarding her primary custody would be detrimental to Sofia and Diego's development, not because Maria was malicious, but because she simply lacked the intellectual capacity to make sophisticated parenting decisions. Robert nodded enthusiastically, adding his own observations to Morrison's notes. He described incident after incident where Maria had supposedly demonstrated her limitations. There was the time she had looked confused during a parent-teacher conference about advanced placement courses, the occasions when she would defer to him completely during discussions with their financial advisor, her apparent inability to understand the complicated scheduling requirements of their children's extracurricular activities. What Robert failed to mention, of course, was that Maria's silence during these meetings had often been a strategic choice rather than a limitation. She had learned early in their marriage that Robert preferred to be the voice of authority in public settings, and challenging that dynamic often led to uncomfortable confrontations later at home. It was easier to let him believe he was the intellectual superior while she absorbed information and formed her own conclusions. Morrison began scheduling depositions with key witnesses who could corroborate Robert's narrative. The first was Patricia Patterson, Robert's mother, who arrived at the law office dressed in her finest pearls and carrying a leather portfolio of what she called supporting documentation. Patricia had always viewed Maria with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain, seeing her as proof of her son's momentary lapse in judgment during his younger years. Under Morrison's careful questioning, Patricia painted a picture of family gatherings where Maria would sit quietly while important decisions were made about investments, education, and social commitments. She described holiday dinners where complex conversations about politics and current events would seemingly go over Maria's head, leaving her to focus on serving food and clearing dishes while the adults talked. Patricia's testimony was particularly damaging because it came wrapped in a veneer of maternal concern. She wasn't trying to be cruel, she insisted, but someone needed to advocate for Sofia and Diego's best interests. The children deserved a stable environment where they could thrive academically and socially, and that required a primary guardian who could navigate the complexities of modern parenting with sophistication and intelligence. The deposition continued with Patricia describing Maria's apparent confusion during family discussions about the children's college planning. She would look lost, Patricia claimed, when they talked about SAT preparation strategies, university application processes, and the importance of building strong extracurricular profiles. It was heartbreaking, really, because you could tell she wanted to contribute, but she just didn't have the educational background to understand what was being discussed. Next came Marcus Chun, Robert's business partner for the past 8 years. Chun's testimony focused on corporate social events where Maria had accompanied Robert, describing her as pleasant but obviously out of her element when business matters arose in conversation. He recalled specific instances where she would excuse herself from groups when discussions turned to market trends, regulatory changes, or strategic planning initiatives. Chun painted these moments as evidence of Maria's intellectual limitations rather than considering alternative explanations for her behavior. He failed to mention that many of the wives at these events similarly excused themselves from business conversations, preferring to discuss other topics. In his testimony, Maria's social choices became proof of her inability to comprehend complex subjects rather than simple personal preference. The most damaging part of Chun's deposition came when Morrison asked about Maria's involvement in company decision-making. Chun testified that Robert had occasionally mentioned consulting with his wife about certain choices, but these conversations seemed to focus on domestic concerns rather than strategic business matters. If Maria had opinions about major corporate directions, Chun claimed, Robert had never shared them during board meetings or planning sessions. Robert himself provided the most extensive testimony, painting a picture of a marriage where he had consistently needed to manage Maria's limitations while protecting her from embarrassment. He described countless instances of having to explain complex concepts to her in simplified terms, from tax documentation to school policy changes to healthcare decisions for the children. His testimony was carefully crafted to avoid appearing overtly cruel while establishing the narrative Morrison needed for their custody case. Robert presented himself as a patient, understanding husband who had spent years accommodating his wife's educational deficiencies. He had hired accountants to handle their finances because Maria couldn't grasp the intricacies of tax planning. He had taken over all communication with their children's schools because the academic terminology confused her. Perhaps most significantly, Robert testified about Maria's media consumption habits, claiming that she primarily watched Spanish-language television programs and struggled to follow English-language news broadcasts or documentary content. This became a crucial piece of evidence in Morrison's argument that Maria was culturally and intellectually isolated from mainstream American society, making her unsuitable to guide their children's development. The introduction of Sarah Mitchell, Robert's new girlfriend, added another dimension to their strategy. Sarah was everything that Robert's legal team wanted to position as ideal for his children's future. She held an MBA from Northwestern, spoke fluent French, and worked as a marketing director for a Fortune 500 company. More importantly, she was eager to testify about her readiness to provide intellectual stimulation and educational guidance that she believed the children had been lacking. Sarah's deposition was carefully choreographed to highlight her qualifications without directly attacking Maria's character. She spoke about her excitement at the prospect of helping Sofia and Diego navigate college applications, discussing her own experience with competitive academic environments. She described conversations with Robert about enriching the children's cultural education through museum visits, theater attendance, and exposure to literature that would broaden their perspectives. The implicit message was clear without being explicitly stated. Sarah represented intellectual sophistication and cultural refinement that would benefit Robert's children in ways that Maria simply couldn't provide. The contrast was intended to be stark and obvious to any judge reviewing the case materials. Elena Rodriguez, Maria's overworked attorney, found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the opposition's thorough preparation and unlimited resources. Morrison's team had compiled hundreds of pages of testimony, character witnesses, and supporting documentation, while Rodriguez was struggling to schedule basic depositions with her limited staff and budget constraints. During strategy meetings with Maria, Rodriguez tried to manage expectations while looking for potential weaknesses in Robert's case. She advised focusing on Maria's dedication as a mother rather than trying to challenge the intellectual superiority narrative that Morrison had so carefully constructed. The goal should be securing reasonable visitation rights and adequate child support rather than fighting battles they couldn't win. Rodriguez's defeatist approach reflected the reality of family court dynamics that favored wealth and social standing over other considerations. Robert's team had the resources to present a polished, professional case with expert witnesses and extensive documentation. Maria's case would rely primarily on emotional appeals and hope for a sympathetic judge. As the depositions concluded and both sides prepared for trial, the legal community began forming opinions about the likely outcome. Court clerks who processed the paperwork noted the disparity in legal representation and case preparation. Local attorneys following the proceedings through professional networks assumed this would be a straightforward custody determination in favor of the more financially stable and intellectually capable parent. The narrative had been established so thoroughly that even objective observers began to view Maria through the lens that Robert's team had created. She became the sympathetic but limited immigrant wife who had been fortunate to marry into American prosperity but lacked the sophistication necessary to guide her children through the complexities of modern life. What none of them realized was that Maria Elena Vasquez had been quietly observing their entire strategy unfold, taking careful note of every assumption, every piece of false testimony, and every calculated misrepresentation of her capabilities. The woman they were systematically underestimating had been preparing her own case with a level of strategic thinking that would soon leave them all speechless. The first crack in Robert's carefully constructed narrative appeared during a routine discovery session on a Thursday afternoon in early March. Elena Rodriguez had requested financial documents spanning the past 5 years, a standard procedure in divorce proceedings, but what arrived at her modest law office was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Maria sat quietly beside her attorney as they reviewed box after box of bank statements, tax returns, investment portfolios, and business correspondence. Rodriguez had expected to find the typical documentation of a wealthy household managed primarily by the husband, with perhaps some basic joint checking accounts and simple investment structures. Instead, she discovered a financial landscape of stunning complexity that seemed to require sophisticated understanding to navigate. The investment portfolios alone contained holdings in 17 different mutual funds, foreign currency exchanges, and commodity futures contracts. The tax returns revealed intricate corporate structures involving multiple LLCs, partnership agreements, and international business transactions. Rodriguez found herself struggling to comprehend the interconnected web of financial relationships that Robert claimed to have managed single-handedly, while his wife remained blissfully unaware of their family's true wealth. As Rodriguez flipped through page after page of documentation, she began to notice small inconsistencies that didn't align with Robert's testimony about Maria's limitations. Several important documents bore Maria's signature alongside detailed notations in the margins, suggesting far more involvement than Robert had acknowledged. When Rodriguez pointed this out, Maria simply nodded quietly and explained that Robert had always told her where to sign, that she trusted his judgment completely. But something in Maria's tone gave Rodriguez pause. There was a precision to her explanation that seemed rehearsed, almost carefully calculated. When Rodriguez asked follow-up questions about specific financial transactions, Maria's responses were surprisingly detailed for someone who allegedly couldn't understand basic investment concepts. She knew exact dates of major purchases, could recall specific amounts transferred between accounts, and demonstrated familiarity with terminology that contradicted her husband's characterization of her financial illiteracy. The discovery session was interrupted when Morrison's office delivered an additional box of documents they had initially overlooked. As Rodriguez examined the contents, she found copies of correspondence between Robert and various business associates, including several email chains that referenced conversations with Maria about strategic decisions. One particular exchange with a potential investor mentioned Robert consulting with his wife about market timing for a major acquisition. When Rodriguez asked Maria about these references, her response was notably different from her earlier explanations. Instead of claiming ignorance about business matters, Maria acknowledged that Robert occasionally asked for her thoughts about certain decisions, though she was careful to emphasize that the final choices were always his to make. Her language became more precise, more confident, as if she was dropping a carefully maintained facade. The most revealing moment came when Rodriguez discovered a series of tax documents that contained what appeared to be calculation errors. The figures didn't align properly with the supporting documentation, suggesting either incompetent preparation or deliberate misrepresentation. Rodriguez mentioned this discrepancy to Maria, expecting another vague response about trusting Robert's expertise. Instead, Maria leaned forward and quietly corrected the calculations, pointing out not just the obvious errors, but explaining the proper methodology for the complex depreciation schedules involved. Her explanation was delivered in perfect English with sophisticated financial vocabulary that contradicted everything Robert's team had claimed about her intellectual capabilities. When Rodriguez expressed surprise at Maria's knowledge, Maria simply smiled softly and said she had always been good with numbers. Meanwhile, across town at Morrison's office, Robert was experiencing his own moment of uncomfortable revelation. His business partner Marcus Chun had arrived for a follow-up meeting to discuss his upcoming trial testimony. But the conversation had taken an unexpected turn when Chun mentioned some concerns about their company's recent financial performance. Chun explained that several of their most successful business strategies over the past decade had originated from ideas that Robert claimed to have developed during private brainstorming sessions at home. When Morrison pressed for more details, Chun admitted that he had always wondered about the sophisticated analysis behind Robert's proposals, particularly given that many of them demonstrated expertise in areas where Robert had no formal training or experience. The conversation became more troubling when Chun revealed that Robert's most profitable business decisions had consistently involved international markets and currency fluctuations, subjects that required specialized knowledge that Robert had never demonstrated in their partnership meetings. Chun had assumed Robert was consulting with expensive financial advisors, but Robert had always claimed credit for these insights as personal inspiration. Morrison found himself asking uncomfortable questions about the source of Robert's business acumen, questions that Robert deflected with increasing discomfort. When pressed about whether Maria might have contributed to any of these strategic decisions, Robert became defensive, insisting that his wife's involvement was limited to listening to his ideas and offering simple emotional support. But Chun's memories painted a different picture. He recalled specific instances where Robert had mentioned discussing complex business scenarios with Maria, describing her feedback as surprisingly insightful for someone with limited education. Chun had assumed these were casual conversations where Maria provided basic intuitive responses, but he was beginning to wonder whether her contributions might have been more substantive than anyone had realized. The most damaging revelation came when Chun mentioned a crucial decision from 3 years earlier that had saved their company from bankruptcy. Robert had proposed a complex restructuring plan that involved renegotiating international contracts and implementing sophisticated risk management strategies. The plan had been brilliant in its execution, but Chun now admitted he had never understood where Robert had acquired the expertise necessary to develop such an approach. Morrison's questioning revealed that the restructuring plan had been developed during a weekend when Robert claimed to have worked alone at home, emerging Monday morning with a complete strategy that demonstrated advanced understanding of international business law and currency hedging mechanisms. Chen had been impressed but puzzled by Robert's sudden expertise in areas far outside his previous experience. As Morrison pressed harder, Robert's explanations became increasingly strained. He claimed to have spent countless hours researching online, consulting with unnamed experts, and developing the strategies through pure intuition and determination. But his answers lacked the confidence that had characterized his earlier testimony about Maria's limitations, and Morrison began to sense potential vulnerabilities in their case. The discovery process continued over several weeks, with each new revelation adding complexity to what Robert had insisted was a straightforward custody determination. Financial records revealed patterns of decision-making that seemed to require sophisticated analysis. Business correspondence suggested collaboration where Robert had claimed sole responsibility. Tax documentation demonstrated familiarity with complex concepts that contradicted his characterization of Maria's intellectual capacity. Perhaps most significantly, court observers began to notice subtle changes in Maria's demeanor during proceedings. While she maintained her quiet, respectful appearance, there were moments when her responses to legal questions demonstrated understanding that seemed inconsistent with her husband's testimony. She would correct minor factual errors in her attorney's statements, offer precise clarifications about financial matters, and demonstrate familiarity with legal terminology that suggested far more sophistication than anyone had expected. Elena Rodriguez found herself reconsidering her initial strategy as the evidence accumulated. Instead of simply seeking reasonable visitation rights and adequate support, she began to explore whether the foundation of Robert's case might be built on misrepresentations that could be systematically challenged. The woman sitting quietly beside her was revealing depths of knowledge and capability that had been hidden beneath years of strategic silence. The cracks in Robert's narrative were becoming more apparent with each passing day, though neither his legal team nor his family had yet recognized the full implications of what was being revealed. They remained confident in their portrayal of Maria as the limited, dependent spouse who needed guidance and protection from complex decisions. What they didn't realize was that Maria Elena Vasquez had been carefully documenting their assumptions and misrepresentations, building a case of her own that would soon turn their confident predictions into devastating miscalculations. The quiet woman they had so thoroughly underestimated was preparing to show them exactly how dangerous it could be to mistake strategic silence for intellectual inadequacy. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically on the morning Elena Rodriguez called her first expert witness to the stand. Dr. Patricia Williams walked confidently to the witness box, her credentials as a linguistics professor at Georgetown University and internationally recognized expert on bilingualism preceding her like a wave of academic authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone present. Judge Margaret Harrison leaned forward slightly as Dr. Williams was sworn in, clearly intrigued by this unexpected development in what had seemed like a straightforward custody case. Morrison looked puzzled from his position at the defense table, flipping through his notes to determine why Rodriguez would need a linguistics expert in a matter that supposedly hinged on simple intellectual capacity. Rodriguez began her questioning by establishing Dr. Williams's extensive qualifications in the study of multilingual cognition and cross-cultural communication patterns. Dr. Williams had spent 30 years researching how highly intelligent individuals navigate complex social and professional environments when operating in their second or third languages, with particular focus on the deliberate communication choices made by educated immigrants in American society. Dr. Williams explained to the court that one of the most common misconceptions about bilingual individuals was equating verbal quietness with intellectual limitation. In reality, many highly educated people from other countries deliberately choose to remain silent in formal settings, not because they lack understanding, but because they recognize the social dynamics at play and prefer to observe rather than risk being judged based on accent or minor grammatical variations. The expert testimony continued with Dr. Williams describing specific behavioral patterns she had observed in her research subjects, patterns that were remarkably similar to the descriptions that had been presented about Maria's conduct during family and business gatherings. The choice to defer to a spouse in public settings, the preference for listening rather than speaking during complex discussions, and the tendency to avoid drawing attention in professional environments were all consistent with sophisticated cultural navigation strategies rather than intellectual deficiencies. Morrison rose to object, claiming relevance, but Judge Harrison overruled him, stating that the witness's expertise seemed directly applicable to the characterizations that had been central to the petitioner's case. Rodriguez continued her questioning, asking Dr. Williams to address the specific claims about Maria's supposed confusion during business conversations and educational planning sessions. Dr. Williams testified that educated multilingual individuals often appeared confused or disengaged in group settings not because they couldn't understand the content, but because they were simultaneously processing information in multiple languages while calculating the social risks of participation. The cognitive load required for this kind of complex analysis often resulted in behavior that appeared passive to monolingual observers who had no framework for understanding the sophisticated mental processes actually taking place. The real bombshell came when Rodriguez asked Dr. Williams to review specific documents that had been introduced during discovery. The expert witness examined correspondence that Maria had signed, noting the precise legal terminology and complex financial language that appeared throughout the materials. Dr. Williams testified that the sophisticated vocabulary and analytical frameworks evident in these documents suggested someone with advanced training in international business and legal concepts. Rodriguez then asked Dr. Williams to examine Maria's educational transcripts, documents that had been requested during discovery but hadn't yet been presented to the court. The expert witness read aloud from the official records, her voice carrying across the now-silent courtroom as she revealed that Maria Elena Vasquez held dual doctorate degrees in international economics and business law from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, one of South America's most prestigious institutions. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Robert's face went pale as he stared at documents he had apparently never seen, while Morrison frantically shuffled through his case files looking for any reference to Maria's educational background. Patricia Patterson gasped audibly from the gallery, her carefully constructed narrative about her daughter-in-law's limitations crumbling in real time. Dr. Williams continued reading from Maria's academic record, detailing her dissertation work on international trade law and currency stabilization mechanisms, her fluency in 5 languages, and her postdoctoral research fellowship at the London School of Economics. The woman who had been characterized as barely able to understand basic business concepts had actually spent years studying the most complex aspects of international commerce and legal framework development. Rodriguez then introduced financial analysis prepared by Dr. Williams, who had also consulted on the business aspects of the case. The expert had identified patterns in Robert's company's most successful strategies that bore the clear hallmarks of Maria's specific analytical methodology, techniques that were taught only in advanced graduate programs and were virtually unknown outside academic and high-level consulting circles. The restructuring plan that had saved Robert's company from bankruptcy 3 years earlier was examined in detail, with Dr. Williams pointing out sophisticated risk assessment models and international regulatory compliance strategies that were consistent with Maria's doctoral specialization. The expert testified that the level of analysis required for such a plan would have been impossible for someone without extensive formal training in international business law. Morrison's objections became increasingly desperate as the testimony continued. He argued that the witness was exceeding her expertise, that the educational credentials were irrelevant to parenting capacity, and that the financial analysis was speculative at best. But Judge Harrison seemed captivated by the systematic dismantling of the assumptions that had underpinned the entire custody case. Dr. Williams addressed the court directly, explaining that Maria's behavior during depositions and family gatherings represented what linguists called strategic code switching, a sophisticated communication strategy used by highly educated multilingual individuals to navigate complex social hierarchies. The apparent simplicity of her responses had actually been precisely calculated legal strategies designed to avoid providing information that could be used against her interests. The expert witness testified that Maria's consistent pattern of deferring to Robert in public settings while maintaining detailed knowledge of complex business and legal matters suggested someone who understood exactly what was happening around her and was making deliberate choices about when and how to reveal her capabilities. This level of strategic thinking required exceptional intelligence and deep understanding of both the technical content being discussed and the social dynamics at play. Rodriguez concluded her examination by asking Dr. Williams to address the implications of Robert's systematic misrepresentation of his wife's qualifications. The expert explained that deliberately concealing a spouse's educational credentials and professional capabilities while claiming credit for their intellectual contributions represented a form of economic abuse that was unfortunately common in relationships where one partner held societal advantages related to gender, nationality, or language. As Dr. Williams stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. Robert's confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the pale, shaken appearance of a man watching his carefully constructed lies unravel in the most public way possible. Morrison was frantically making notes, clearly trying to salvage a case that had just lost its foundational premise. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, during which Maria remained seated quietly beside her attorney, maintaining the same composed demeanor she had displayed throughout the proceedings. But now her silence carried an entirely different meaning. Instead of appearing limited or confused, her quiet confidence suggested someone who had been patiently waiting for the truth to emerge, secure in the knowledge that her actual qualifications would speak louder than any of the misrepresentations that had been constructed around her. The woman who had been portrayed as intellectually inadequate had just been revealed as one of the most highly educated people in the courtroom, and everyone present was beginning to understand that they had been watching a masterclass in strategic patience rather than a simple custody dispute between unequal partners. The afternoon session resumed with Elena Rodriguez approaching the evidence table, her arms laden with bankers' boxes that had been conspicuously absent from the morning proceedings. Judge Harrison watched with growing interest as Rodriguez began methodically removing document after document, each one representing another piece of evidence that would systematically dismantle the fraud that had been perpetrated on the court. Rodriguez announced that she would be presenting 15 years of business correspondence, all written in flawless English and bearing Maria Elena Vasquez's signature on complex international trade agreements, partnership negotiations, and strategic planning documents. The first exhibit was an email thread from 2019 between Maria and a consortium of European investors, where she had personally negotiated a $12 million manufacturing partnership using sophisticated legal terminology that demonstrated mastery of international commerce law. Morrison leaped to his feet, objecting that these documents had not been disclosed during discovery, but Rodriguez calmly explained that they had been specifically requested as part of Robert's business records. The documents had been in Robert's possession all along, stored in a private server that he had failed to mention when producing materials for the court. This oversight, Rodriguez suggested, appeared to be deliberately calculated to conceal his wife's actual role in building their business empire. As Rodriguez read portions of the correspondence aloud, the courtroom heard Maria's voice for the first time through her written communications, and it was nothing like the limited, confused person that had been described in testimony. Her emails demonstrated sophisticated analysis of market conditions, regulatory compliance requirements, and strategic positioning that had guided Robert's company through multiple economic challenges over the past decade. One particularly damning email chain from 2021 showed Maria developing the complete strategy for entering the Asian markets, including detailed risk assessments, cultural considerations, and regulatory navigation plans that had ultimately generated over $40 million in revenue for Robert's company. The emails were addressed to Robert with copies to Marcus Chun, contradicting Chen's earlier testimony that Maria had never been involved in strategic business planning. Judge Harrison interrupted the proceedings to ask Morrison whether he had been aware of these communications when his client testified about Maria's supposed lack of business acumen. Morrison's stammering response made it clear that Robert had concealed this information from his own legal team, raising serious questions about perjury and evidence tampering that went far beyond the scope of a custody dispute. Rodriguez continued with video evidence from business conferences where Maria had delivered presentations to international clients, speaking fluently in English, Spanish, and Portuguese about complex trade regulations and market analysis. The videos showed a poised, authoritative professional who bore no resemblance to the confused, overwhelmed person that Robert's witnesses had described under oath. Robert's face had gone ashen as he watched footage of his wife commanding rooms full of business executives, explaining sophisticated economic theories and regulatory frameworks with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering these subjects. His hands trembled slightly as he realized that everyone in the courtroom could see the stark contrast between reality and the fictional narrative he had constructed. The most devastating evidence came when Rodriguez presented Robert's computer hard drive, which had been forensically examined by a court-appointed expert. The analysis revealed that every major business proposal, strategic plan, and market analysis that Robert had claimed as his own work had actually been drafted on Maria's laptop before being transferred to his system and presented under his name. Digital timestamps showed a consistent pattern over 12 years where complex documents would be created on Maria's computer, often during late-night sessions that coincided with Robert's business trips or social commitments. The documents would then appear on Robert's system within hours, usually with minor formatting changes, but identical analytical content and strategic recommendations. Rodriguez called Robert's accountant, David Kim, to testify about the company's financial management. Kim appeared visibly uncomfortable as he was forced to admit under oath that Maria had been the one handling all corporate strategy and financial analysis for the past decade. She had prepared quarterly reports, managed cash flow projections, and developed the sophisticated investment strategies that had built Robert's reputation as a brilliant businessman. Kim's testimony revealed that he had been instructed by Robert to send all detailed financial communications directly to Maria, who would analyze the information and provide strategic recommendations that Robert would then present as his own insights during board meetings and investor presentations. Kim had assumed this was simply an unusual division of labor within their marriage, never considering that Robert might be systematically taking credit for his wife's expertise. The accountant was forced to acknowledge that Maria's analytical work had been so sophisticated that he had often consulted additional experts to verify her calculations and projections, only to discover that her work was invariably more accurate than industry-standard models. Her financial forecasting had consistently outperformed expensive consulting firms that Robert's competitors employed, giving their companies significant competitive advantages in strategic planning. Marcus Chun was recalled to the witness stand, where his earlier testimony began to crumble under Rodriguez's methodical questioning. Confronted with email evidence showing his direct correspondence with Maria about strategic initiatives, Chun admitted that he had deliberately minimized her involvement in his previous testimony to support Robert's custody case. Chun revealed that Maria had been the primary architect of their most successful business ventures, including the international expansion that had tripled their company's revenue over 5 years. She had conducted the market research, developed the regulatory compliance frameworks, and designed the risk management strategies that had made their overseas operations profitable from the very beginning. The business partner's most damaging admission came when he testified that Robert had explicitly asked him to conceal Maria's contributions during legal proceedings, suggesting that her involvement in the company might complicate custody arrangements. Chun had agreed to support Robert's version of events, never considering that he might be participating in systematic fraud against both the court and Maria herself. Sarah Mitchell, Robert's girlfriend, sat in the courtroom gallery watching her assumptions about Maria's capabilities dissolve in real time. The sophisticated, accomplished woman revealed through evidence bore no resemblance to the limited, dependent person Robert had described. Sarah began to understand that her relationship with Robert was built on lies about his achievements and systematic theft of his wife's intellectual property. Patricia Patterson's reaction was even more dramatic. The woman who had spent years condescending to her daughter-in-law now realized that Maria was by far the most accomplished member of their family. Every dismissive comment about Maria's intelligence, every patronizing explanation about complex topics, every assumption about cultural and intellectual superiority had been directed at someone whose academic and professional credentials dwarfed everyone else in the room. Judge Harrison's patience with Robert's legal team was clearly wearing thin as evidence mounted of deliberate deception and possible perjury. She asked Morrison directly whether he had made any effort to verify the claims about Maria's educational background and business involvement before presenting them to the court. Morrison's weak response about relying on his client's representations only increased the judge's visible irritation with the entire proceeding. The afternoon continued with Rodriguez presenting evidence of Robert's pattern of intellectual theft extending back to their early marriage. College transcripts showed that Robert had struggled academically while Maria had been completing her doctoral work, yet somehow his business acumen had appeared suddenly after their wedding, coinciding precisely with Maria's entry into his professional life. Even their children's academic success was revealed to be primarily attributable to Maria's guidance. School records showed that Sofia and Diego's achievements in advanced mathematics and international studies directly reflected their mother's expertise, not their father's involvement. Teachers' notes consistently mentioned the exceptional quality of help the children received at home, particularly in subjects requiring analytical thinking and complex problem-solving skills. As the evidence presentation concluded, Robert sat silently beside his attorney, no longer attempting to maintain his confident demeanor. The successful businessman facade had completely collapsed, revealing someone whose entire professional reputation had been built on systematic theft of his wife's intellectual property and expertise. The woman sitting quietly across the courtroom had been revealed as the true architect of everything Robert had claimed as his own achievements, and everyone present was beginning to understand the profound injustice that had been perpetrated not just against Maria, but against the court system that had been manipulated by Robert's calculated deceptions. The stage was set for Maria's own testimony, where the quiet woman who had been so thoroughly underestimated would finally speak in her own voice, delivering justice with the same precision and intelligence that had made her husband's career possible while remaining invisible behind his arrogant assumptions about her capabilities. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Judge Harrison set down the last piece of evidence and turned her attention directly to Maria Elena Vasquez, who had remained quietly seated throughout the systematic destruction of her husband's credibility. The judge's voice carried a weight of authority that made everyone present understand that this moment would determine not just custody arrangements, but the ultimate resolution of what had become a case about truth, justice, and the consequences of systematic deception. "Mrs. Vasquez," Judge Harrison said, her tone respectful but firm, "given the extensive evidence that has been presented today regarding your qualifications and contributions, I believe this court would benefit from hearing directly from you. Would you care to address the proceedings yourself?" Maria rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate and composed. She turned to Elena Rodriguez and spoke quietly but clearly, asking her attorney to thank the court-appointed translator for his services, but explaining that she would prefer to speak for herself. The translator looked confused for a moment before gathering his materials and stepping aside, suddenly understanding that his assistance had never actually been necessary. When Maria faced the court, her transformation was immediately apparent to everyone present. The uncertain, hesitant woman who had appeared to struggle with legal terminology was gone, replaced by someone whose bearing commanded instant respect and attention. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear, articulate, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone completely comfortable with complex ideas and formal proceedings. "Your Honor," Maria began, her English flawless and her tone measured with the precision of someone accustomed to addressing important audiences, "I appreciate this opportunity to clarify certain misrepresentations that have been presented to this court. For the past 12 years, I have maintained strategic silence while my husband built his career on the foundation of my intellectual property, my analytical work, and my professional expertise. Today, that silence ends." The courtroom was transfixed as Maria systematically began to dismantle every claim that Robert's team had made about her capabilities. She spoke without notes, drawing on her extensive memory to recount specific instances where Robert had taken credit for her ideas, her analysis, and her strategic planning. Her presentation was methodical, logical, and devastatingly thorough, delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent years documenting every detail of the deception. Maria explained that she had deliberately chosen to remain quiet during family gatherings and business events not because she couldn't understand what was being discussed, but because she had learned early in their marriage that Robert's ego required him to be perceived as the intellectual authority in their relationship. She had made the strategic decision to allow him this public image while quietly building the evidence that would eventually protect her and their children. She recounted specific conversations where Robert had dismissed her suggestions in private, only to present identical ideas as his own innovations during business meetings the following week. She described the systematic way he had excluded her from receiving credit for work that had generated millions of dollars in revenue for their company, while simultaneously claiming that she was too limited to understand basic business concepts. The most powerful moment came when Maria addressed Robert directly, her voice remaining calm and controlled while delivering words that cut through his remaining pretenses like surgical instruments. She told him that she had known for years about his plans to divorce her and seek full custody of their children, and that she had spent those years methodically preparing for this exact moment. Maria revealed that she had been secretly recording conversations where Robert had discussed his strategy to portray her as intellectually inadequate, including his instructions to witnesses about what they should emphasize in their testimony. She had documented his systematic theft of her work, his deliberate concealment of her educational credentials, and his calculated campaign to gaslight her about her own capabilities. The recordings, Maria explained, captured Robert explicitly telling Marcus Chun and his mother Patricia exactly what stories they should tell about her supposed limitations. She had audio evidence of Robert coaching his new girlfriend Sarah about how to present herself as a superior alternative to Maria's supposed intellectual deficiencies. Every piece of testimony that had been presented against her had been orchestrated by Robert himself, and Maria had the evidence to prove it. Judge Harrison interrupted to ask whether these recordings would be made available to the court, and Maria calmly replied that her attorney had copies of everything, along with 15 years of additional documentation that she had been carefully collecting and organizing. She explained that she had anticipated this day since the early years of their marriage, when Robert's pattern of intellectual theft had first become apparent. Maria then addressed the broader implications of Robert's fraud, explaining how his systematic deception had affected not just their marriage, but their children's understanding of their own heritage and their mother's capabilities. She described Sophia and Diego's confusion when their father would dismiss their mother's intelligence, while simultaneously relying on her expertise for their homework help and educational guidance. The children, Maria revealed, had been unknowingly caught in the middle of Robert's gaslighting campaign, watching their father take credit for their mother's work while teaching them to view her as less capable than she actually was. She explained that this pattern of deception had created psychological harm that would require years of therapy to address, damage that went far beyond the financial fraud Robert had perpetrated. Maria's testimony continued with detailed explanations of specific business strategies that Robert had claimed as his own innovations, strategies that she had developed using specialized knowledge from her doctoral studies in international economics and business law. She demonstrated familiarity with complex regulatory frameworks, market analysis methodologies, and risk assessment techniques that were clearly beyond Robert's educational background or professional experience. The most damaging revelation came when Maria presented evidence of Robert's current financial situation, which she had been monitoring through her continued involvement in their business operations. Contrary to his claims about being the successful architect of their company's growth, Robert had actually been making increasingly poor decisions since Maria had begun limiting her behind-the-scenes contributions in preparation for their divorce. The company was now facing significant financial difficulties due to Robert's inability to replicate the analytical work that Maria had been providing for over a decade. Several major clients had terminated their contracts after receiving substandard strategic advice that lacked the sophisticated analysis they had come to expect. Robert's reputation in the business community was already beginning to suffer as his lack of actual expertise became apparent to colleagues and competitors. Maria explained that she had been quietly establishing her own consulting firm, using her real credentials and professional network to build relationships with international clients who valued her expertise in global markets and regulatory compliance. Several of Robert's former clients had already approached her about continuing their strategic partnerships under her own company, recognizing that she had been the actual source of the analysis they had valued. Judge Harrison asked about Maria's intentions regarding custody arrangements, and Maria's response demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had characterized her approach to the entire situation. She explained that her primary concern was ensuring that Sofia and Diego understood the truth about their mother's capabilities and accomplishments, while also protecting them from the ongoing psychological damage caused by Robert's systematic deception. Maria requested primary custody with supervised visitation for Robert, explaining that his pattern of lying and emotional manipulation made him unsuitable for unsupervised time with their children. She presented evidence of Robert's attempts to turn the children against her by reinforcing false narratives about her limitations, behavior that child psychology experts would classify as emotional abuse. The financial arrangements Maria proposed were equally devastating to Robert's future prospects. She requested the return of all intellectual property that Robert had stolen over their marriage, along with compensation for 15 years of unpaid consulting work that had built his business reputation. She also sought control of the business assets that had been generated through her uncredited contributions, effectively stripping Robert of the empire he had built on her expertise. Maria's concluding remarks addressed the broader issue of recognition and justice that her case represented. She spoke about the countless women, particularly immigrant women, whose contributions were systematically minimized or stolen by husbands who exploited cultural biases and language prejudices to maintain undeserved advantages. Her case, she explained, was about establishing accountability for intellectual theft and emotional abuse that often went unrecognized by legal systems. As Maria returned to her seat, the courtroom remained completely silent, everyone present still processing the transformation they had witnessed. The quiet, apparently limited woman who had been described in testimony had revealed herself to be one of the most articulate, intelligent, and strategically sophisticated people any of them had ever encountered. Robert sat in stunned silence, his face pale and his hands shaking as he realized the full extent of what had just happened. His entire life had been built on lies that had just been systematically exposed and dismantled by the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. His reputation, his business, his credibility, and his future had all been destroyed by his own arrogance and the patient, methodical preparation of someone whose intelligence he had never recognized. Judge Harrison announced that the court would recess for deliberation, but her tone suggested that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the fraud was undeniable, and justice would be swift and comprehensive. When court reconvened 3 hours later, Judge Harrison delivered a ruling that reflected the magnitude of Robert's deception and the court's determination to provide complete justice for Maria and their children. Primary custody was awarded to Maria, along with control of all business assets that could be traced to her intellectual contributions. Robert was granted minimal supervised visitation until he completed extensive psychological evaluation and therapy for his pattern of manipulative behavior. The financial judgment was even more devastating. Robert was ordered to pay Maria 15 years of back compensation for her uncredited consulting work, calculated at the rates charged by comparable international business consultants. He was also required to publicly acknowledge her contributions to all business successes he had previously claimed as his own achievements, including formal corrections to industry publications and professional organizations. 6 months later, Maria Elena Vasquez had established herself as one of the most sought-after international business consultants in their city, working with clients who valued her expertise in global markets and regulatory compliance. Her children, Sofia and Diego, were thriving under their mother's guidance, finally understanding the truth about their brilliant parent who had been hidden behind years of systematic deception. Robert, meanwhile, had been forced to sell his remaining business interests to pay the court-ordered compensation. He was working at an entry-level position with a competitor, no longer able to rely on stolen intellectual property to maintain his professional reputation. His relationship with Sarah Mitchell had ended when she realized that his entire persona had been built on lies and theft. The case had become a landmark example of justice for intellectual property theft in marriage. with Maria's story inspiring other women to document and challenge similar patterns of systematic deception and credit theft. This story of quiet strength triumphing over arrogant deception really shows how dangerous it can be to underestimate someone based on stereotypes or assumptions. Have you ever witnessed someone being undervalued because of their accent, background, or quiet nature? What did you think of Maria's patient strategy of documenting everything for years before revealing the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments about how this story resonated with your own experiences or observations about hidden strength and ultimate justice.